MEE Live. I'm Matilda Mallinson. It's Thursday, the 4th of December, 2025. Today, how organised crime is shaping the war in Sudan. But first, the headlines. Yasser Abu Shabab, described as an Israeli-supported militia leader in Gaza, has reportedly been killed, according to Israeli media, though conflicting accounts are emerging in the absence of any independent verification. Channel 14 reported his death, while Israeli army radio claimed he was killed by unidentified assailants. No further details have been confirmed on the circumstances. Hillary Clinton is facing a deluge of criticism for blaming Americans' growing support for Palestinians on, quote, totally made up videos on TikTok, and saying young American Jews, quote, don't know history and don't understand Israel's war on Gaza. The former Democratic presidential candidate spoke on Tuesday at a summit hosted by the right-wing Israeli paper Israel Hayom in New York City. Clinton, who is also a former US Secretary of State, said what young Americans were being told on social media was not just one-sided, it was pure propaganda. Young Americans hit back at what they called condescending comments, saying social media didn't drop the bombs on Gaza, Israel did, and the US supplied them. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's coalition boycotted a parliamentary vote on Wednesday endorsing US President Donald Trump's proposal to end the two-year Gaza war. The motion, introduced by opposition leader Yair Lapid, was mostly symbolic since Netanyahu had already backed Trump's plan after Israel agreed to a ceasefire with Hamas in October. And you can read the full stories on middleeasteye.net. Two and a half years of civil war in Sudan has torn the country apart and created one of the largest humanitarian crises on the planet. Fought between the Sudanese armed forces and the paramilitary group Rapid Support Forces, or between SAF and RSF, the war has displaced over 12 million people and created conditions of famine in several Sudanese cities. The fighting began when a power struggle between President Abdel Fattah al-Burhan and his deputy Mohammed Hamdan Dagalo, known as Hemeti, turned violent in April 2023. But outside support for both sides has helped to prolong the war, with Saudi Arabia and Egypt primarily backing Burhan's SAF, while the UAE supports Hemeti's RSF. Though both groups are accused of committing atrocities, US determined that the RSF was committing genocide in January of this year, charging the paramilitary force with systematic violence against Sudan's ethnically non-Arab population. The tide seemed to be shifting in March when the Sudanese armed forces retook the capital of Khartoum from the RSF. But the paramilitary group's string of territorial losses only prompted the UAE to increase arms supplies in the following months, allowing it to make a comeback. Though its control was confined to the southwest of the country, the conflict reached a turning point when the RSF seized the city of al-Haftar in November, bringing the entirety of the Darfur region under its control and triggering another mass wave of displacement. Almost immediately, reports emerged of mass killings and sexual violence among the survivors of RSF's assault, which killed over 2,000 people and displaced over 100,000. Many civilians escaping al-Haftar fled to neighbouring Chad, bringing the total number of Sudanese refugees in the neighbouring state to an estimated 1 million. Chad's eastern provinces have struggled to keep up with the refugee influx. In areas like Wadai, the population has increased by 60% in the past 2 years, while US foreign aid cuts have crippled the ability of NGOs to meet surging humanitarian needs. The ensuing strain on resources that have led to growing tensions with locals. But this animosity is not limited to civilians. Tensions have also grown between Chad's government and the Sudanese armed forces after SAF's deputy commander called Chad's airport legitimate targets for allegedly facilitating weapons transfers from the UAE to the RSF. Chad replied saying the statement was a, quote, declaration of war. SAF's frustration with alleged arms smuggling to its opponent has strained its relations with its neighbours, particularly authorities in Chad and Libya. Libya's General Khalifa al-Haftar, whose forces control the eastern half of the country bordering Sudan, has long been accused of smuggling fuel and other supplies to the RSF. Despite costing billions in lost revenues, analysts point to the general's long-standing ties with the UAE, one of its primary financial and political patrons, arguing that the trade has strengthened the local control of Haftar's forces. Chad's government had previously backed Burhan Saf, but is thought to have quietly reoriented towards logistical support for the RSF as its relationship with the UAE developed under its current government. The two countries signed a military cooperation agreement in June of 2023, and trade between the partners has grown by a third in the last year alone. This support has created lucrative war economies, bordering Sudan, empowering local authorities in both Libya and Chad, while also enabling the RSF to consolidate its hold on Darfur. And so, despite growing outrage over reports of atrocities by the RSF in Sudan, supplies to the group have only increased in recent months. This growth was mapped in a recent paper by the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime, highlighting how smuggling networks in Chad and Libya have acted as conduits for Emirati-supplied weapons to the paramilitary RSF. Now, behind this research is Emadeddin Badi, Senior Fellow at the Global Initiative Against Transnational Organised Crime, which gives you a sense of something at the heart of this story. Now, he joins me in the MEE Live studio. Emadeddin, welcome to MEE Live.
Thank you very much for having me.
Now, one takeaway I had from reading your research is that a war like the war in Sudan, that doesn't just happen when two military rivals turn against each other and use what is at their disposal. You know, this is not like, say, the genocide in Rwanda, which, as deadly as it was, generally was executed with the use of easily accessible traditional weapons like machetes. In Sudan, the bloodshed at its worst could be seen from space. This required drones, tanks, arms that have come from faraway countries. I mean, British weapons were found on the battlefield in Sudan, despite the UK government saying that they have robust safeguards in place to prevent this. How does this happen? Like, what needs to happen on the ground for violence like this to occur in Sudan?
Well, I would say that there was significant investment, essentially, into this occurring. So there was a lot of effort put into embargo busting networks, in many cases transnational. This is what my research partly uncovered, but this is also the work of other organizations, UN panel of experts, etc., relative to how particularly the rapid support forces, but equally I would say the Sudanese armed forces as well, were supplied. Yes, there were stockpiles in Sudan, but especially recently over the past, I would say, year or year and a half, you're seeing the type of more advanced weaponry that wasn't within Sudanese stockpiles before 2023. So there have been a lot of countries that have essentially busted the arms embargo on Sudan. Ironically, the research that I worked on, you're looking at two embargoes being violated, that of Libya and that of Sudan, because the networks are transnational in many cases and our third countries are being
this embargo busting, is that illegal? Is that an illegal trade in weapons that is coming through into Sudan?
Of course. I mean, essentially when countries are under embargoes, you are not allowed to send them or procure them with weapons, the actors in those countries. So in this particular case, you're violating not just one, but in many cases two embargoes for it.
And it's just extraordinary, you know, the scale at which these weapons have been going into countries that, as you say, are apparently under arms embargoes. I think just to give people a sense of what that looks like in the ground, in your research, you talk about this field hospital that was established by the UAE in Chad in July. Ostensibly, it was founded to serve Sudanese refugees. The UAE denies this, but what does that hospital actually do in reality, and how does it play into this illegal international inflow of weapons soldiers and more.
Both the New York Times reporting and UN panel of experts on Sudan reporting, as well as my own research, point to this being a key node for arms trafficking. This field hospital was set up, and even the infrastructure within it was set up to feed the RSF with fuel, weaponry, etc., and also treat injured RSF soldiers. That's another facet of this. So yes, while the UAE denies this, there's wide reporting of throughout 2024 at least, that field hospital in particular being the main node through which the RSF was supplied to carry out its siege of al-Fashir, which has been going on for 18 months prior to the takeover, but also much of the fighting in Khartoum as well.
Okay, so you have people who are selling arms to the fighting parties in Sudan coming in through Chad and through Libya is another country that you mentioned that is really central to this economy. How widespread is the economic impact of this arms trade? You know, how many countries are seeing their economies violated, I suppose, legally in order to get these weapons to these warring parties?
From a proliferation standpoint, particularly proliferation of weapons standpoint, my research points to actually the number of countries being affected, including not just Libya and Chad, but also Niger and Mali. And this is wholly, I think, unappreciated by policymakers. Ironically, the fact that the conflict is still being waged in Sudan actually is acting almost like putting a lid on the wider impact of the conflict, because once the conflict in Sudan contracts, that would mean that proliferation and the weapons, as well as the mercenaries that are drawn there, will actually look at what they could do elsewhere. So sell their weapons to more in Libya, more in Chad, more to Niger and Mali, and also sell their services.
Right, so once these weapons have gotten in, they don't just disappear. If there is to be a cessation in the violence in Sudan, then they could pour out into this region.
It will largely depend on what the settlement, if there is one, looks like as well.
Now, I think this is really relevant right now because it plays into tropes, like racist tropes, right, of Africa as a continent in which violence is inevitable. I say this because, you know, just this week we've seen Donald Trump, who is literally the president of the United States, say this about Somalia. This is on Tuesday.
Somalians ripped off that state for billions of dollars, billions, every year, billions of dollars, and they contribute nothing. The welfare is like 88%. They contribute nothing. I don't want them in our country, I'll be honest with you, okay? Somebody would say, oh, that's not politically correct. I don't care. I don't want them in our country. Their country's no good for a reason. Their country stinks.
Answers were long-winded, by the way.
Now, what your research paints is that war is not just destabilizing to the country it impacts, it's externally destabilizing. And the inflow of weapons to Sudan, well, this has involved, in no small part, third-party states. You've already talked about the UAE. But its impact could be much wider regionally than just on Sudan. How devastating has it already been to stability and peace in the neighboring countries you mentioned, like Libya and Chad?
Well, it's not just externally destabilizing, it's also externally enabled in many cases. And for Sudan, there would be a mutually hurting stalemate if actually enough pressure is put on the United Arab Emirates at this stage. So that would pave the way for a ceasefire and a political settlement in Sudan. The very fact that there isn't is symptomatic of the very racist, I want to say, tropes that you mentioned. On the impact, essentially at this stage, I would say that we actually haven't seen the full impact yet, because depending on how political settlement in Sudan is crafted, and I here stress political settlement, not ceasefire, because for many Sudanese, a ceasefire is not enough. And there have been unilaterally ceasefire declared, for instance, by the RSF, where they've continued and carried out their genocide in Darfur. So depending on what a political settlement will look like, that will have potentially far-reaching consequences on Libya, on Chad, on Niger, and on Mali. At this stage, I think the country that is most at threat of political instability is Chad, because of the inter-ethnic ties, and particularly a particular tribe that's outlined in my report as important is the Zaghawa group, from which the president of Chad hails, who is disproportionately affected by the genocide in Darfur.
Now, as you rightly point out there are, of course, for violence, always local factors, ethnic conflict, for example, that drive this. But the picture you paint is really an economy of war, a situation in which there are many people incentivized financially to keep violence alive. The picture you paint here, central to the story, are mercenaries. Now, mercenaries are professional fighters, people who are paid, sometimes paid a lot, to fight in wars that have little or nothing to do with them nationally, ideologically, personally. And as you demonstrate, within this region, mercenaries their role has sort of grown from just being paid fighters to key operators of this economy. You say that they have made themselves sort of essential, entrenched into the regional economy. So tell us that story. How did mercenaries in the Sahel become what sounds, to be honest, like a mafia?
Well, there's two elements almost to this. It's like a dual structure that has been set up. So there's a structure whereby it's states that engage with quasi-state actors in Sudan and in Chad to transfer the weaponry. But then it's another story for those weapons to actually reach Sudan. And that's the layer where mercenaries have offered their services and their know-how of both how transfers occur, but also their networks between different ethnic groups or tribal groups in southern Libya and eastern Chad to transfer the weaponry to the rapid support forces around which much of my research has centered. So over time, and as this war sort of continued, and as the need to supply the RSF also grew, particularly after their loss of Khartoum and the need to sort of consolidate control over Darfur, you've seen mercenaries become increasingly more central to how transfers occur. And you've equally seen increasingly cargo flights being sent to eastern Chad and more recently to southern Libya.
And it's not just the supply of weapons that mercenaries have become very controlling of, right? Another example would be gold. There's a really massive gold economy that is traveling through that region. How much of that is controlled by mercenaries? And I suppose, is that the gold that is reaching the rest of the world? If you and I were to go and buy gold, would it be gold that was implicated in this mercenary economy?
Well, the UAE would claim, and has recently, a lot of its influencers have claimed that less than 1% of its gold are exported from Sudan. However, what's part of missing in that story is that actually a lot of the Sudanese gold gets smuggled to other countries by both the RSF, but also in many cases some of the transnational organized criminal groups through, in some cases at least, mercenaries. Mm-hmm. So there is a disproportionate amount of Sudanese gold that goes out to third countries like Libya and like Chad, and that ends up at the United Arab Emirates in Dubai.
Right. And there's even some very unexpected goods that I hadn't seen mentioned before I read your report. For example, Starlink. You talk about how Starlink is being transported by these networks and how that's actually really transformed the nature of the conflict and of the illicit economy in the region as well.
Yeah, I would say Starlink is playing both, ironically, a positive and negative role, because for the positive roles, probably the resistance committees, the community kitchens, etc., and civilians also using it to draw attention to what is going on. But equally, and this is happening across the region, both in eastern Chad, southern Libya, and in Sudan with the RSF, increasingly armed groups are using it. And the case of the RSF is pretty instrumental as well, where you're seeing them on TikTok and on Facebook advertising the fact that they have Starlinks. You see it retrofitted on their pickups. It helps to, in one side, it's almost a battle of narratives or a morale booster, in that they're showing off more advanced equipment than the SAF, their counterpart in the war. On the other side, Sudan war is waged on a very large territory, so you need coordination. You need a level of mobility between the different front lines in Darfur and Kordofan. So the layer, that Starlink of communication that it provides, is very useful to a warfare of that kind.
Now let's talk about who these mercenaries are, because they come from further afield than many people may realize, namely Colombia. Now, I remember I was actually in Colombia in August, and there was this seemingly extraordinary story that colleagues of mine were trying to verify at the time. A UAE plane carrying Colombian mercenaries shot down by Sudanese armed forces just before landing in the RSF-controlled part of Darfur. Where are these mercenaries coming from, and how does it come to be that Colombians are being drafted in to fight in a war in Sudan?
I would say this is probably one of the UAE's modus operandi, as it tends to, at times where its allies are not doing so well on the battlefield, supplement their ground forces with mercenaries that serve a dual role: advanced ground force, but also operating more advanced equipment, military equipment in particular, whether that's for electronic warfare, for the operation of drones, or anything else, really. So it's done that in Libya previously by funding the Wagner Group, according to U.S. Treasury, but it also is doing that now with Sudan by funding, essentially, or funneling in Colombian mercenaries to help the RSF. So essentially, the Colombians are playing a role of a ground force, and also playing a power amplifying or a military amplifying role, essentially, by supporting the RSF's ground operations in Darfur. At first, they were transferred through Libya, and there was a famous incident last year where they were captured, and the joint forces affiliated with the Sudanese armed forces displayed the Colombian passports and identity documents. Since then, they've been spotted increasingly around al-Haftar, as well as in Kordofan.
Okay, so Colombians, you mentioned the Wagner Group, that's Russians. Are there many other nationalities that you've been able to identify as operating on the ground?
Yes, you have Chadians as well, mercenaries that were involved very early on, since April, really, of 2023. Some were incentivized because of monetary transaction, like for financial reasons, sorry. And there's a wide variety of nationalities. I think the Sudanese armed forces would claim that the RSF comprises at least mercenaries of 17 different nationalities. Maybe some of this is hyperbole, but I do think that there's at least 10 different nationalities of mercenaries involved on the RSF side.
What's in it for them? Are they, how much or how well are these mercenaries being paid? Or is it the case that they themselves are often exploited and desperate?
It ironically severely depends on the mercenaries' utility and value, because even in the case of the Colombians, there's actually two subsets of Colombian mercenaries, some which play a more specialized role in terms of operating advanced equipment, and then another subset of Colombian mercenaries that's almost cannon fodder, essentially. And you clearly see also that they're being transferred and transported to the front lines in different ways and through different nodes.
Really? And so these Colombians who you say are essentially cannon fodder, these are likely people who are themselves victims of exploitation.
Yeah, exactly.
All of this, I mean, it sounds expensive. A mercenary war is an expensive war. Where is that money coming from?
It would be difficult to pinpoint exactly where, but I would say that this war is probably, in a tragic way, a war that is almost funded by Sudan itself, and through the networks that have been established, extractive networks, particularly from Gulf countries, and this precedes the war, whereby both not just the gold, but also a lot of agricultural products, a lot of farming investments, etc., were controlled by Gulf networks, and also livestock as well of Sudanese farmers and pastoralists have been used to essentially then reinvested into this conflict. So there's really no incentive for a lot of the stakeholders involved on either side to actually stop because this is lucrative. And much of those economic interests have been shielded from the impact of the war. So actually, while farmers in Sudan are growing more and more destitute, the channels or supplies of livestock, the supplies of agricultural products that the GCC, that some Gulf countries have in Sudan, those have not been significantly interrupted by the war.
Okay, so I suppose who's really paying for it is the people of Sudan. And not just Sudan, but I suppose Chad and Libya and these other countries that have seen destabilization as a result. Well, then maybe the question is, who's profiting?
I would say that there's an element of profiteering both at the Sudanese side between the two warring parties, really, and also the foreign stakeholders that are fanning the flames of the conflict. Because this is, in many ways, this has echoes of Libya as well, which has a war that was funded by the Libyan, I don't want to say taxpayers, but Libyan coffers. And I would say it's the same case in Sudan, where you have a lot of Sudanese paying the price and foreign stakeholders as well as political elites profiteering from it.
I mean, you allude to these foreign states, third-party states that are also deeply involved. We have talked about the UAE. The UAE, of course, denies this, but it's sort of, an open secret that the UAE is probably the key funder to the RSF. I also mentioned near the start that British weapons had been found in Sudan. The UAE is buying its weapons from countries like the UK. I mean, the UK is one of the really major provider there. So in this organized crime economy of war that is destabilizing not just Sudan, but the wider Sahel region, how widespread do you think global responsibility is?
I would say it's pretty paramount, particularly at this stage. We're dealing with a continuation of a genocide, what is globally recognized as a genocide in Darfur in the early 2000s. So states are legally complicit. The UAE does not have a defense industry of its own robust enough to be supplying different paramilitary groups in Libya, in Yemen, in Sudan. So it's incumbent upon states that are supplying and exporting military hardware to the UAE to be scrutinizing those exports. And I wouldn't restrict this necessarily exclusively to arms, but also consider other punitive measures at the level of trade. Instead, what we're seeing is that a lot of states are actually going for more foreign direct investments from the UAE and not even mentioning, shying away from mentioning the war in Sudan. We've had reporting today of the FCO suppressing warnings of a genocide in Darfur. We've also had reporting of Canada, for example, being a supplier of weapons and Canadian weapons ending up in Sudan through the UAE. So it's incumbent upon those states to have the safeguards necessary and the political will to act on those safeguards, because ironically, in many cases, the safeguards exist. They're just not applied.
Now, helpfully, you actually lay out some solutions that could be implemented by the international community to prevent the situation getting any worse. And you paint a little bit of a scary picture of what it could look like. You say that, from a transnational organized crime perspective, the most dangerous phase is yet to come. It's not the war in Sudan and the devastation that we're already seeing. It's what happens if that war ends and there are all these arms, weapons, all these people with their fingers ready on the trigger and waiting to see, what to do with that economy. So in order to prevent that happening, what are the solutions that need to be implemented?
I think one of the things perhaps that I don't mention in the report is the extent to which also infrastructure has been developed, particularly around the border zones. I mean, you referred to the field hospital. There are now also new border crossings, new air bases being refurbished, etc., around Sudan. So that infrastructure has been developed to serve as nodes for transfers. It will have to play a new role after the Sudan war contracts or is politically settled in some way, shape, or form. Moreover, the more advanced weaponry, right now there's a pull factor to keep it into Sudan that that pull factor will also no longer exist after a Sudanese political settlement. Depending on how Sudanese political settlement also is shaped, many of the mercenaries that got involved over the course of the war, and not all of them got involved earlier on in the war, some got involved more recently, especially as the war raged on in Darfur, they will also have to figure out what they want to do or what they can do in a new Sudan.
But is it preventable? Is that outpouring of violence preventable?
I think it should be mitigated, because we're past the point of this being completely and entirely preventable. We're, unfortunately, because the warnings of what could happen in al-Haftar from 18 months ago, etc., should have been heeded. Unfortunately, at this stage, you need to be able to forecast what the implications of that are and what you need to do to deter further deterioration in Sudan, let's say.
So how do you get rid of these weapons? They're there now. How do you get rid of them?
I think the report lays out some answers, but unfortunately not the entire solution to what should be done. I also account for the lack of political will, unfortunately, to do more. But some of their policy recommendations include the destruction of some of the weapons, community stabilization in areas at the border, because some people are destitute, and for them engaging in smuggling is almost a daily subsistence way of living. So you need to essentially deal with the political realities at the borderlands, and also there should be some political will to deter the foreign stakeholders from further fanning the flames of the war in Sudan.
Emadeddin Badi, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you.
And that is all that we have time for on today's show. But before we lose you, we would love to hear from you. Please send in your thoughts, comments and questions on social media at Middle East Eye, or email meelive@middleeasteye.net. We'll be here 5 p.m. every Tuesday and Thursday. That's noon in New York. See you then.